Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Let yourself arrive here slowly tonight. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing you need to solve before morning, no thought you must finish thinking. Wherever you are, a bed, a couch, a dim room with the world switched off, let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day. Feel the weight of your own body settling into whatever is beneath you. That is all you have to do right now. Just settle and listen, and let the sound of a calm voice carry you toward sleep. You do not need to remember any of this. If a single idea stays with you by morning, that is more than enough. And if none of it stays, that is fine too. This is not a lesson to be studied. It is a slow walk through an old and curious idea, taken together at the pace of someone with nowhere to hurry to. Take a slow, deep breath. In, gently, and out. Longer. Feel free to let your eyes close whenever they want to. I will keep talking softly, and you can simply drift along beside the words. Tonight we are going to spend some quiet time with a strange and unsettling thought that a French doctor wrote down more than a century ago, in the year 1895. The thought is this: a person who is, on their own, thoughtful and reasonable, a cultivated man, in his words, can be dropped into the middle of a crowd, and something happens to that person. Something slips. He wrote that in a crowd, such a man descends several rungs down the ladder of civilization. That isolated, he may be a cultivated individual, but in a crowd he becomes something closer to a barbarian, a creature acting by instinct. Not because he grew stupid, not because he was foolish to begin with, but because the crowd did something to the shape of his mind. Now, hold that image for a moment softly, the way you would hold a warm cup in the dark, a ladder, and a person, calm and clear at the top of it, who somehow, without deciding to, begins to climb down. One rung, then another, down toward something older and rougher and more instinctive than the person they were when they were alone. That is the picture at the center of everything we will explore tonight. And the question underneath it, the real question, the one that keeps this old idea alive after all these years, is a simple and slightly frightening one. Why do smart people lose their minds in a crowd? Why does intelligence, which feels like it should protect us, turn out to be no shield at all? Here is the part that makes this more than a museum piece, more than a dusty book about torch-lit mobs in some distant century. You might be picturing a crowd as a physical thing, a square packed with bodies, a riot, a stadium roaring as one, a mass of people pressed shoulder to shoulder, shouting the same words. And yes, that is a crowd. But it is not the only kind, and it may not even be the most powerful kind anymore. Because the man who wrote all this down had a wider idea in mind. He was not only talking about bodies in a square, he was talking about a shared state of mind. A crowd to him did not require a place at all. It required only that many minds begin to feel and think and move together, as if they had merged into one. And if that is true, if a crowd is a state of mind rather than a place, then the most powerful crowd you will ever step into has no physical location whatsoever. It has no square, no streets, no bodies you can see. It is the quiet river of words and images that scrolls past your eyes when you are lying alone in a room exactly like the one you may be lying in right now. You can be entirely by yourself, no other human being within 100 feet of you, and still be standing in the middle of an enormous crowd. That is the strange thing we are circling tonight. The crowd does not need to gather around you. It can pour through a small, bright rectangle held in your own two hands, and you would never know you had joined it. But let us not rush ahead. Let us come back to that gentle, unsettling claim, because it deserves to be tested before we simply believe it. It is one thing for an old doctor to declare that reasonable people go strange in groups. It is another thing to show it. And here is where the story gets sharper, because many years after that book was written, other people, careful people, in quiet rooms with clipboards, decided to actually check. There was a psychologist named Solomon Asch, and in the year 1951, he ran an experiment so simple it almost sounds like a joke. He sat a person down at a table with a small group of others, and he showed them cards. On one card, a single line. On another card, 3 lines of clearly different lengths. And the task could not have been easier. Just say which of the 3 lines matches the length of the single line. That was all. A child could do it. The answer was obvious as telling a long stick from a short one. There was no trick in the lines themselves. Anyone looking at them with working eyes and a quiet mind would get it right almost every time when tested alone. But here is the quiet trap Asch had laid. The other people at the table were not really fellow volunteers. They were in on it. They had been told beforehand to sometimes give the wrong answer, calmly, confidently, out loud, one after another. So the real subject would sit there, and the first actor would name a line that was plainly, visibly wrong. And the second would agree with the first. And the third. And the fourth. Each of them, one by one, looking at the same simple lines you were looking at, and each of them naming an answer your own eyes were telling you could not possibly be right. And then it would be your turn. Sit with that for a moment. You can see the lines. You know which one matches. It is not close. It is not ambiguous. Your eyes are not lying to you. And yet, around the table, every single voice before yours has said something that contradicts the plain evidence in front of your face. So what do? You feel it, don't you, even imagining it in the dark? A little heat rising, a small crack of doubt where there should be none. Am I the one who is wrong? Did I miss something? Should I say what I see? Or should I say what they said? What Asch found is the fact that sits at the heart of tonight's whole question. About 3 out of every 4 people, roughly 75%, went along with the group and gave the obviously wrong answer at least once. 3/4 of ordinary, intelligent, clear-eyed people denied what their own eyes were showing them, simply to agree with a group of strangers naming the length of a line. Not because they were fooled, many of them could see perfectly well that the group was wrong. But something in the pull of the group was stronger than something in the trust of their own sight. And so they folded. They said the short line was the long one, and they heard their own voice say it, and they went along. Let that land gently, because it is important, and because it is kind of a relief, too, if you turn it the right way. It means that when you have found yourself, at some point in your life, agreeing with a room full of people about something you privately doubted, nodding along, going quiet, saying the safe thing instead of the true thing, you were not weak, and you were not uniquely foolish. You were doing the most ordinary human thing there is. 3 out of 4 of us do it, over something as trivial as a line on a card. Imagine how much harder that pull becomes when the question is not about lines at all, but about who is good and who is bad, who to trust and who to cast out, what is true and what is a lie. And notice what this quietly proves. It proves that intelligence is not the shield we imagine it to be. The people in that experiment were not unintelligent. Smart people conformed, careful people conformed. It was not a failure of the mind's horsepower, it was something else entirely, something about how a mind behaves when it feels the presence of a group leaning the other way. The brightest person at that table was just as likely to feel the crack of doubt, just as likely to fold. Being clever does not lift you out of the crowd. In some ways, it may only give you better reasons, afterward, for why you went along. So here is the promise for tonight, laid out plainly, so you can relax into it and stop wondering where we are going. We are going to understand this, slowly, gently, from the inside. We are going to look at how it actually works, how a person who is thoughtful when alone becomes something looser and rougher in a group, and we are going to name the exact levers that do it, because that old French doctor named them with startling precision. And then, later, we are going to see how the same machinery runs today, not in some distant square, but in the glowing feed you may have been holding in your hand 10 minutes before you started listening to this voice. And at the very end, we will arrive somewhere useful, a way to feel it happening to you, and a way to hold on to your own mind while you are standing right in the middle of a group. That is where we are headed. There is nothing to figure out along the way. Just come with me. But I want to give you the real key to this whole night early, so it can sit in the back of your mind and quietly rearrange things while you drift. Because the ordinary way of telling this story is that a crowd makes you lose your mind. That in a group you go mindless, empty, a blank thing swept along. And that is the version most people carry. It is flattering in a way, because it lets you imagine that the mob out there is made of hollow people, and you, the clear-headed listener, are not one of them. It is comfortable. It is also, it turns out, not quite right, and the truer version is stranger and a little more haunting. You do not lose your mind in a crowd, you are handed a new one. Let that sit. It is the quiet turn the whole video rests on, so I will say it once more, slowly, and then let it rest. You do not go empty. You do not become a blank. Something far more subtle happens. The mind you walk in with, the personal one, the private one, the one with your own name on it, and your own doubts, and your own sense of what you would and would not do, that mind steps back. And a different way of thinking steps forward. A borrowed one. The group's one. You keep reasoning. You keep feeling. You are not asleep. But now you are reasoning and feeling as a member of the crowd, not as yourself, and the frightening thing is how completely natural it feels from the inside. You do not sense the switch. It is not like being knocked out. It is like being quietly, invisibly retuned, handed a new set of eyes, and told, without a word, this is how we see now. We will come all the way back to this near the end, and it will make more sense then, once we have watched the machinery up close. For now, just let it settle. Not a mind lost, but a mind swapped. Now, before we go any further, let me set a small marker down that will matter later, because I promised you stakes, and I want you to have a loose thread to hold. I mentioned that the most dangerous crowd today might have no square. Here is one hard, specific measurement of that, and I am only planting it now, like a seed, to come back to when we are ready. Some careful researchers, working in our own century, went and measured how ideas actually travel through those glowing feeds. How far, how fast, how deep a piece of news spreads from person to person online. And they found something that fits our old French doctor uncomfortably well. A false story travels faster than a true one, not a little faster. Dramatically faster, by one striking measure, a lie moving through the network about 6 times faster than the truth. 6 times. The truth plods along, careful and slow, while the falsehood goes racing ahead, leaping from mind to mind. Hold that number loosely. 6 times faster. We will return to it, and to why it is exactly what the old theory would predict, once you understand the engine underneath. For now, let it just be a small unsettling fact resting in the dark. The truth, out there tonight, is losing a race it does not even know it is running. So let us finally meet the man who saw all of this coming more than 130 years ago, before there were any feeds, before there were any screens, before a single one of these measurements could have been taken. His name was Gustave Le Bon. He was born in 1841 in a small French town called Nogent-le-Rotrou, and he lived a long life, dying in 1931, so his years stretched from the age of horse-drawn carriages nearly to the age of radio. He trained as a physician, as a doctor, at the University of Paris. But he was a restless sort of mind. He never really settled into practicing medicine in the ordinary way. Instead, he wandered, intellectually, across almost everything. He wrote about medicine, yes, but also about anthropology, about archaeology, about physics, about the deep workings of human societies. He was what an earlier age would have called a polymath, a person who tries to drink from every well of knowledge at once. And I will be honest with you as we go, because it matters. Le Bon was not a gentle or a fair-minded man in all his views. Some of what he wrote across his long life was narrow and prejudiced, and has been rightly set aside. So when we listen to him tonight, we are not treating him as a wise elder handing down settled truth. We are treating him as a sharp and flawed observer who noticed something real and named it vividly, even if he did not fully understand what he was looking at. We will hold his theory, as what he claimed, and let the later, more careful science tell us where he was right and where he was wrong. That is the honest way to walk with a figure like this. Take the insight. Leave the arrogance. Keep your own judgment lit. In 1895, Le Bon published the book that would outlive him and nearly everything else he ever wrote. In French it was called Psychologie des foules, the psychology of crowds. In English it is known simply as The Crowd, or more fully, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. It was a small book, but it struck a nerve so deep that it never really stopped ringing. It sold and sold. It went through edition after edition while he was still alive. It was translated into language after language, carried across borders, read by people who agreed with it and people who were horrified by it. It has stayed in print more or less continuously for over a century. One of the most widely read books about human psychology ever put on paper. Not because it was careful, not because it was fair, but because it named something that people reading it recognized with a shiver. Yes, they thought, I have felt that. I have seen that. I did not have a word for it, and now I do. And the something he named, the beating heart of the whole small book, was an idea he stated grandly in the way of his century. He called it the law of the mental unity of crowds. Now, do not let the heavy phrase tighten your shoulders. Let me set it down softly and turn it over so you can see what it really means. Because underneath the old-fashioned grandeur, it is a simple and almost dreamlike idea. The law of the mental unity of crowds. What Le Bon meant was this. When a group of individuals comes together into what he called a psychological crowd, not just standing near each other, but joined in feeling, turned toward the same thing, moving as one. Something new appears that was not there before. a kind of single, shared mind, a collective mind, as if all those separate minds had, for a while, dissolved their edges and pooled together into one larger mind that none of them alone had chosen and none of them alone controlled. And this collective mind, Le Bon insisted, does not think the way any of its members would think on their own. It is not the sum of their intelligence. It is not an average of their wisdom. It is a different creature entirely, with its own moods, its own hungers, its own way of moving, usually simpler, rougher, more emotional, and more extreme than any single reasonable person inside it. The individuals feel it. They feel and think and act in a manner quite different from the way each of them would feel and think and act if they were standing alone. That is the law. Gather the minds, and a new mind is born on top of them, and it is not a wiser mind, it is a wilder one. And here is the piece of Le Bon's idea that keeps it dangerous even now, that keeps it from being safely locked in his own century. He did not think this psychological crowd needed to be a physical mass at all. It could be. A mob in a street was one example, an easy one to picture. But the mental unity he described could scale. It could stretch across a whole movement of people who never stood in the same room. It could spread through a nation. It was a state of mind, and states of mind are not bound to any particular patch of ground, which means, and here is where the old dead doctor reaches a cold finger across the years and taps you on the shoulder, a crowd can form among people who are physically completely alone, scattered across a country, across the world, each one in a separate room, in a separate bed, in the separate quiet of their own night. And still they can be pulled into a single collective mind, feeling the same feeling, moving the same way, at the same time, believing the same thing with the same heat, without one of them ever seeing another's face. He was, without any way of knowing it, describing the feed. He was describing the timeline. He was describing the strange modern experience of lying alone in the dark and feeling a wave of collective anger or fear or certainty wash over you, coming from 1,000 strangers you will never meet, and finding, if you are honest, that some of that wave has become your own feeling, indistinguishable now from anything you arrived with. He named that in 1895. He called it a crowd. And he was right that it does not need a square. He even had a name for the age he saw coming. He opened his book by announcing with the confidence of his time that humanity was entering something he called the era of crowds. He believed the old world, a world run by small numbers of powerful individuals, kings and elites and quiet rooms of decision, was passing away, and that a new force was rising in its place. The force of the mass, the voice of the many, gathered and roaring, becoming the thing that decided the shape of events. He saw the numbers of ordinary people entering into the great decisions of nations. And he found it, frankly, alarming because of who he was and where he stood. But alarmed or not, he was pointing at something true, the era of crowds. And if he could have looked forward from his study to our own night, to the billions of scattered glowing rectangles, each one a small window into an enormous, restless, ever-moving crowd, I think even he would have been startled by how completely his era arrived. So this is where we stand, at the end of this first slow stretch of our walk together. We have the image, the one to carry with you as your breathing slows. A cultivated, reasonable person standing at the top of a ladder, and a crowd forming around them, or through them, or on the screen in front of them, and something beginning to happen, a quiet descent, one rung, then another, down toward a rougher and more instinctive way of being. We have the proof that it is real, and that cleverness does not save you, 3 out of 4 people, at that plain little table, with the plain little lines folding to the group against the plain evidence of their own eyes. We have the man, Gustave Le Bon, flawed and sharp, and his small, enduring book from 1895, and his grand law of the mental unity of crowds, the idea that when minds gather, a new and wilder mind is born on top of them. And we have the strange turning key to the whole thing, resting now in the back of your mind, where it can do its quiet work while you drift. You do not lose your mind in a crowd. You are handed a new one. What we have not yet done is look inside the machine. We have watched it work from the outside, and we have named the people who described it. But we have not yet seen the actual levers, the specific, nameable forces that reach into a reasonable person and begin, gently and invisibly, to swap one mind for another. And there are 3 of them, according to Le Bon. 3 engines that turn a gathering of separate individuals into a single collective creature. There is the feeling that comes from sheer numbers, a strange sensation of invincible power that arrives simply from being many. There is a thing he called contagion, where a feeling or an act spreads from person to person the way an illness spreads through a room, catching and catching until everyone has it. And there is the deepest and most unsettling one, the one he compared to being under a hypnotist's spell, where a person in a crowd stops being fully the author of their own actions and begins to move as if directed by something outside themselves. And beneath all 3, quietly holding the door open for them, there is a single hinge. One small thing that has to give way before any of it can begin. When that hinge turns, the reasonable person's ordinary sense of responsibility, the inner voice that says, "I would never," simply and completely disappears. That hinge, and how gently it turns, is where we will go next, but not yet. For now, just rest with the picture. The ladder, the lines on the card, the scattered crowd with no square, and a new mind, waiting to be handed to anyone who gathers. Let your breath go slow and long. There is nothing to hold on to here, nothing to keep. Let the ideas drift past like lights on dark water, and let yourself sink a little deeper into the quiet, because we have a long, slow way still to go, and there is no hurry at all in reaching it. The first engine is the simplest one, and in its simplicity there is something almost embarrassing, because once you see it, you wonder how you could have missed it in your own life, how many times the thing that changed your feeling was not new information, not a better argument, but simply the presence of other people standing where you were standing. Le Bon called it the sentiment of invincible power. When a person finds themselves surrounded by a crowd, truly surrounded, pressed in on all sides by shoulders and sounds and the heat of other bodies, something shifts in the chest that has nothing to do with thinking. It is not a thought, it is a sensation. A kind of warmth or a kind of electricity that arrives unbidden and says, "We are many. We cannot be stopped. Whatever I could not do alone, we can do together, and no one will be able to hold us." Le Bon believed this feeling arrives before any reasoning begins. It is not deduced. It does not require evidence. It comes with sheer numbers, the way warmth comes with fire, automatically, without being asked. And here is the crucial part, the part most summaries skip over. That sensation of invincible power does not just make a person feel stronger, it makes them feel less watched, less accountable. Because a person standing alone in a square knows, feels in their skin, that whatever they do as themselves. Their name is attached, Their face is known. The thing they do is theirs, and they will carry it afterward. But a person standing in a crowd of thousands begins to feel that they are, in some wordless way, hidden. Dissolve the crowd is many, and they are part of the many, and the many is a thing that cannot be pointed at in the way a single person can. And so, quietly, without deciding to, they begin to act in ways they would not act if they were alone. Le Bon was not the first to notice this, but he was among the first to name it clearly and to argue that it was not an accident or a failure of character, it was a structural feature of the crowd itself. Given enough people, given enough of that nameless warmth of numbers, any individual's ordinary restraint begins to thin. The inner voice that says, "I would not normally do this," that voice does not vanish. But it grows quieter, and the crowd grows louder. And at a certain point, the crowd simply drowns it out. Take a slow breath. Let that land somewhere quiet in you. There is nothing to fix here, nothing to judge, just a thing to know, in the dark, about what it is to be human. There was a study done in the autumn of 1976 in a neighborhood in Seattle on Halloween night. A researcher named Edward Diener wanted to understand what anonymity actually does to a person's behavior, not in theory, but in the real, candy-lit, costumed mess of an ordinary October evening. He arranged for children who came trick-or-treating to encounter a situation where they could, if they chose, take more than one piece of candy from a bowl that had been left unattended. The adult who opened the door for them would then step away and let the children help themselves. Some of the children came alone and were asked their names. They knew who they were. In the social sense, they were visible, named, present as individuals. Others came in groups and were not asked their names, and so existed in that moment as anonymous, costumes covering faces, the group covering identity, no adult watching with the steady gaze of recognition. The difference in what the children did was not small. The children who were anonymous in groups took far more than they were supposed to. Far more. The costume, the crowd, the absent name, these three things together lowered the floor of what felt permissible and lowered it significantly. And these were ordinary children, not troubled children, not cruel children, children who, walking home alone the next morning in their own clothes, with their own faces, would have been indistinguishable from any other child on the block. Put them in a group, give them a costume, take away their names, and the calculus of what is allowed quietly changed. This is what Le Bon was reaching for. Not a theory about bad people, a theory about the structure of situations. The costume was not a metaphor. The crowd was not a metaphor. The absence of a name was not a metaphor. These were conditions. And conditions, Le Bon argued, matter more than character. Given the right conditions, a person of good character will behave in ways that, back in their own kitchen the next morning, they would find difficult to explain. That is the first engine, the sheer quiet physics of numbers. Now let the second engine come in, because it is stranger and more beautiful in its strangeness. And it explains something about the way feeling moves through a room that rational models of behavior simply cannot account for. Contagion. Le Bon chose that word deliberately. Not influence, not persuasion, not argument. Contagion, the word you use for illness, for something that passes through the air between bodies without requiring consent or comprehension. A feeling moves through a crowd, he argued, the way a cold moves through a classroom. One person has it, then another, then suddenly everyone does. And no one decided to have it, no one voted on it, no one sat down and reasoned themselves into the grip of it. It simply spread, and it arrived. If you have ever been in a large audience, at a concert, at a ceremony, at a sporting event, you have felt this. You arrived as yourself, with your own mood, your own private weather. And then something happened on stage, or on the field, or at the front of the room, and the people around you reacted, and before you had time to think about what they were reacting to, you were reacting too. Your throat tightened, or something moved in your chest, or you were laughing before you had understood what was funny. The feeling arrived before the thought, travelling along some channel that bypassed analysis entirely. This is not a character flaw. It is, in a deep sense, what human beings are built to do. We are social creatures, in the oldest sense. We evolved in groups, reading groups, tracking the emotional weather of everyone around us for survival. The person who could not feel what the group was feeling, could not calibrate their alarm to the group's alarm, was the person who did not run when they should have run, who did not freeze when the rest of the group froze. Contagion is old. It is baked in. Le Bon did not invent it. He was the first to name it as the second engine of the crowd. And the crucial detail, the one that makes it dangerous in the particular way Le Bon feared, is that contagion carries no information about truth. A feeling spreads because it is strong, because it is vivid, because the person next to you is visibly having it, and the person behind them is visibly having it, and the brain, scanning its social field, treats the intensity of shared feeling as signal. It treats widespread emotion as evidence, but it is not evidence, it is weather. And weather can be wrong. A panic spreads this way. A rumour spreads this way. A conviction that some person or group is monstrous and must be dealt with spreads this way. The feeling arriving with such force and such unanimity that questioning it begins to feel not like independent thought, but like some kind of moral failure. The crowd is certain. The certainty is everywhere. And the human brain, built for social survival, reads everywhere certainty as truth, even when the truth is nowhere near it. Rest here for a moment. Take a long, slow breath. Feel the room around you. The quiet of it, the fact that there is no crowd here, no one next to you whose certainty is pressing against yours. There is just the soft weight of the dark and the words, and you can hold them loosely and put them down whenever you are ready. The third engine is the one Le Bon found most disturbing, and I think when you hear it described you may understand why. He called it suggestibility. But the word he reached for first was not suggestion. The word he reached for was hypnosis. In 1895, hypnosis was not a fringe curiosity. It was a serious subject at the edge of legitimate medicine. Jean-Martin Charcot, one of the most celebrated physicians in Europe, the man who had trained the young Sigmund Freud and dozens of other brilliant students at his clinic in Paris, the Salpêtrière, had been studying hypnotic states for years, using them to understand hysteria and suggestion and the strange ways the mind could be made to believe and even feel pain or its absence based entirely on what it was told. Charcot and the doctors around him had established that a person in a hypnotic state was, in a very precise sense, no longer fully the author of their own experience. They believed what the hypnotist told them. They felt what the hypnotist directed them to feel, and they did not experience this as coercion. They experienced it from the inside as simply the truth of things. At the Nancy School, a rival group of physicians a few hundred miles away, led by Hippolyte Bernheim, the researchers were extending this further. Bernheim argued that suggestion was not a special trick done to unusual or vulnerable individuals. He argued it was a universal capacity. Any person, given the right conditions, could be made highly suggestible. The hypnotic state was not rare. It was something the mind slid into when the normal conditions of critical scrutiny were suspended. Le Bon took this and pressed it sideways into the crowd. He argued that a person in a crowd enters a state that functions like a mild, collective hypnosis. Not a deep trance, not the theatrical kind, with a swinging pocket watch and the subject slumping in a chair. Something subtler, a softening of the critical faculty, a state in which the individual becomes unusually receptive to suggestion, unusually willing to follow, unusually inclined to feel and believe things they would, in a quieter moment, evaluate more carefully. And the terrifying corollary, the part that made him most uneasy, was that this state is invisible from the inside. The hypnotized subject does not feel hypnotized. They feel lucid. They feel present. They feel convinced. Their certainty arrives to them not as a state they have been led into, but as a perception they have independently arrived at. This is precisely what makes the third engine so powerful and so difficult to guard against. You do not feel the suggestibility, you feel the conclusions. Le Bon was drawing on real science to make this claim, even if the science was rougher than he let on, and even if his own synthesis was looser than he acknowledged. There is a strand of intellectual honesty worth observing here. Le Bon was not the only person thinking about these things in the 1890s. The Italian criminologist Scipio Sigele had published a book called La Folla Delinquente, The Criminal Crowd, in 1891, 4 years before Le Bon's The Crowd appeared. Sigele had worked through many of the same phenomena, the way individuals in groups behave differently than they do alone. The patterns of criminal behavior in crowds, the collective lowering of moral inhibition. He had done it carefully, with source citations and specific cases, in the slower, more rigorous manner of academic criminology. Gabriel Tarde, a French sociologist and contemporary of Le Bon's, had developed what he called the laws of imitation, a careful and genuinely original account of how beliefs and practices and fashions spread through societies, person to person, by imitation. Tarde wrote directly about the crowd and the public and the mechanisms of social contagion. And he wrote about it with considerably more methodological care than Le Bon would bring to the same territory. Le Bon rarely cited his sources. This is a polite way of saying that many of his contemporaries and scholars working after him believed he had taken ideas that were already in the air, ideas that Sigele and Tarde had done the harder work of developing, and had presented them in a form so vivid and so readable and so dramatically confident that the world gave him credit for the whole edifice. Whether this amounts to plagiarism or to the slightly more forgivable act of brilliant synthesis, scholars still disagree. What is not in dispute is that Le Bon wrote with a kind of electrifying clarity that Sigele and Tarde, for all their rigour, did not quite match. And the world then as now reads clarity. The crowd, and there is something poetically apt about this, followed the most contagious voice. He deserves that acknowledgement. And so do they. Now take a breath. Feel the weight of the pillow, the coolness of the air. You do not need to hold any of this precisely. Let it settle like sediment in still water, loose, slow, somewhere under the surface. Let us go back to the hinge, because everything else turns on it. You have the 3 engines now, the invincible feeling of numbers, the spreading warmth of contagion, the softening of critical scrutiny into something like suggestion. But these 3 need a door. They need a threshold. They need one small condition to be met before any of them can fully begin to work. And that condition, Le Bon argued, is this: the individual must feel, in some genuine and undefended way, that they are no longer alone and visible as themselves. The word he used was anonymity. But he meant something more specific than a mask or a costume. He meant the dissolution of personal accountability. He meant the moment when the inner voice that tracks what I am doing, not what we are doing, but what I, this person with this name and this history, am choosing to do right now, goes quiet. When that particular kind of self-watching softens, even briefly, the ordinary brakes on behavior soften with it. Le Bon was very direct about this. He wrote that in the crowd, the sentiment of responsibility, the feeling that connects a person to the consequences of their own actions, disappears entirely. Not weakens. Disappears. And this is precisely why the crowd could do things that none of its individual members would do or could do alone. Not because the individuals changed, but because the architecture of accountability changed. The crowd is diffuse. Responsibility in a crowd is diffuse. And a diffuse responsibility is, in practice, very close to no responsibility at all. Think about how this works in a simple way. If you are the one person in a room who knocks a glass off a table, the glass is yours to pick up. Everyone saw. You saw yourself. The accountability is clear and present, and you feel it. Now imagine the same glass knocked off the same table in the middle of a jostling crowd of 100 people. Who knocked it? Who knows? Anyone might have. Everyone might have. No one is responsible, or everyone is, which in the practical language of feeling amounts to the same thing. The glass stays on the floor. The feeling that would make you, individually, bend to pick it up, the felt weight of personal responsibility, is simply not triggered in the same way when you are one of 100. You are not bad. You are not lazy. You are behaving as the architecture of the situation instructs you to behave. The situation changed. And situations, as Le Bon kept insisting, change what people do. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. And here is where Le Bon moved into territory that feels almost more contemporary than his own century. Because he did not stop at the physical crowd. He understood, or began to understand, in a way that his language could only partially contain, that the psychological crowd did not require a physical location. The thing that made a crowd was not bodies in a square. It was the shared mental state, the felt anonymity, the contagion of feeling, the submission of individual judgment to the rhythm of the group. And those things could happen, he suggested, at scale, without anyone being physically present at all. The crowd was a psychological event. Wherever its conditions were met, it existed. He was writing this in 1895. He did not know about the internet. He did not know about social media platforms or algorithmic feeds or the architecture of online attention. But what he described with that word, psychological crowd, fits the topology of the modern comment thread, the modern outrage cascade. The modern platform pile on with an accuracy that is almost uncomfortable to sit with. Now let us walk through what Le Bon said a crowd actually looks like. From the inside. Not the feeling of being in one, but the character of one. The traits it reliably develops once it has formed. He catalogued them. He was precise about them. And they are, each of them, recognizable, the first thing a crowd becomes is impulsive. Le Bon used the word impulsiveness and meant something very specific. The crowd acts on whatever stimulus presents itself in the moment without the delay that individual deliberation would normally impose. A crowd is a present tense creature. It feels, and then it does. The gap between stimulus and response, which in an isolated individual can be filled with thought and consideration and hesitation, in a crowd collapses to almost nothing. Whatever is vivid and immediate and emotionally charged reaches in and pulls the crowd into motion before any reasoning has time to operate. This is not stupidity. It is structure. The individual does not have time to think inside the crowd because the crowd is already moving, and the first instinct of the crowd body is to move with it. Connected to this is what Le Bon called mobility, the crowd's capacity to swing, rapidly and completely, from one emotional extreme to another. A crowd that was cheering moments ago can be screaming moments later. A crowd that felt solidarity can fracture into violence. There is no middle register. The crowd does not hold moderate feelings for long. It migrates to extremes, and then it migrates again, and the speed of migration depends entirely on what the next vivid thing is that presents itself. This is the emotional weather of the crowd, hot, mobile, and incapable of settling into the kind of nuanced, grey, held in tension feeling that is the natural register of a thoughtful individual sitting alone. The crowd is also credulous, extraordinarily credulous. Le Bon observed that a crowd will believe things an individual would scrutinize and reject, because the crowd thinks. And here we come to one of his most important and most quoted observations, not in logic, but in images. A crowd cannot follow a reasoned argument. It cannot hold a chain of deduction in suspension, test each link, and arrive at a conclusion. The mental act required is simply incompatible with the crowd state. What the crowd can do, what it does with enormous power and speed, is respond to a vivid image. A simple, striking, emotionally charged picture. The more concrete and the more emotionally loaded, the better. The more abstract and the more nuanced, the more invisible. This is not a flaw in specific crowds. Le Bon believed it was structural. The crowd mind works through images the way water runs downhill, naturally, inevitably, following the shape of the terrain. Give a crowd a clear, simple, emotionally charged image of a threat, or a hero, or an enemy, or a promised good, and the crowd will act on it with remarkable coherence. Try to offer instead a series of qualifications, a weighing of considerations, a nuanced picture that requires holding contradictory things in mind at once, and the crowd will not engage with it at all. It will simply not land. The nuance slides off the crowd, mind the way water slides off a smooth stone. He wrote that crowds have never thirsted after truth, that they turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduces them. It is one of his most quoted lines, and it is easy to read as contempt, as an aristocrat sneering at the masses. But look at it again in the light of what modern psychology has found. The crowds Le Bon was describing were not specially ignorant or specially uneducated people. They were ordinary people, under ordinary crowd conditions. And what he was observing was not a failure of intelligence. It was a feature of the cognitive mode that crowd conditions produce. The hunger for the clear, simple image, the resistance to the complicated truth, these are not character traits. They are consequences of the state. A crowd that has been seduced by an image will protect that image with a ferocity that looks, from outside, like fanaticism. Le Bon noted this too. The crowd is intolerant. It does not permit dissent. This is partly because dissent requires the kind of nuanced attention the crowd state cannot support. The crowd mind cannot hold the dissenter's argument long enough to evaluate it. It can only register the dissenter's presence as a disruption, as a threat to the shared feeling that is the crowd's structural glue. And threats to the glue are dealt with the way any social organism deals with threats, by expulsion, by silencing, by turning the full force of the collective certainty against the one voice that is speaking differently. The crowd is also, and this one tends to surprise people, authoritarian, not in the political sense, though it can become that. In the deeper psychological sense, the crowd craves authority. It craves a strong, clear, confident voice, telling it what to see and what to feel and what to do. This craving is not a contradiction of the crowd's other traits. It makes perfect sense. A crowd in a state of high emotional arousal, with its critical faculty softened into suggestibility, with no internal mechanism for rational deliberation, is a creature that is activated but has no compass. The strong leader, the meneur, Le Bon called them, the driver, provides the compass. The leader says this is the thing, and the crowd, suggestible and image-hungry and yearning for resolution, believes it, not because they are told to believe it, because the conditions they are in make belief the path of least resistance. This is not a portrait of bad people. Le Bon's portrait is not about cruelty or wickedness. It is about the way ordinary human psychology responds to a set of ordinary conditions. The impulsiveness, the mobility, the credulity, the intolerance, the authoritarianism, none of these require extraordinary persons to produce them. They require ordinary persons in the conditions of a crowd. And that distinction matters enormously because it means that no one is immune. Not by virtue of education, not by virtue of intelligence, not by virtue of good intentions or careful moral upbringing. Given the conditions, the numbers, the contagion, the suggestibility, the anonymity, ordinary people produce crowd behavior. Every time. This is the claim. And it is a claim that the century after Le Bon would test, over and over, with results that are both sobering and, in the end, instructive. Rest here. Let your eyes soften. The room is dark and still. There is a long way still to go in this, and all of it will come at this slow, unhurried pace. There is nothing to remember, nothing to keep, just the listening, and the quiet, and the soft slide of words in the dark. Let your breath go long and easy. Let whatever you have been carrying today soften a little at the edges. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You just need to breathe, and listen, and be here, in this room, in this dark, for a little while longer. Now, one more thing about the crowd's character, before we follow the thread into the toolkit, the four-step recipe, as precise in 1895 as anything written since, for making a group of people believe something, regardless of whether it is true. There is a nuance in Le Bon's portrait that almost every popular account of his work leaves out. It is, I think, the most important nuance, because without it, the picture of the crowd he draws is only half true, and a half-true picture, if we are honest, is a way of flattering the reader into thinking the danger belongs to other, worse people. Le Bon did not say crowds are simply degraded and destructive. He said they are amplifiers. He said the crowd state, the dissolving of individual identity into a shared collective identity, is a state that magnifies whatever it is given. Given violence and resentment and a scapegoat, it becomes a mob that does things no individual in it would do alone. But given courage and self-sacrifice and a cause worth dying for, it becomes something else entirely. Something that could genuinely reach a moral level, Le Bon wrote, far above the isolated individual, far above. The single soldier who walks forward under fire when every individual instinct screams to run does so partly because the crowd, the unit, the shared identity is holding him. The bystander who, inside the contagion of a group acting heroically, runs into the burning building they would never have approached alone. The crowd amplifies both downward and upward, depending entirely on what it is being given and what it is being asked to become. This matters, not as consolation, not as a softening of the warning, but as precision. The mechanism is not evil. The mechanism is powerful and directional and almost completely dependent on what is being poured through it. And that means the question, the real question, the one this whole long night is slowly moving toward, is not how to escape the crowd. The crowd is a feature of human life. You will always be in some form of it, some version of collective mind, some shared identity that shapes your feeling and your judgment. The question is, what is the crowd being given? Who is pouring what through the mechanism, and can you see it happening? That is where the leader comes in. And the four-step recipe. And the lineage that connects Le Bon's 1895 blueprint to the particular, specific, measurable dynamics of the world you are in today, and the one you will return to tomorrow. We will go there slowly. There is no rush. You can let your eyes close all the way if they want to. The words will be here, drifting through the dark, telling the next part of this long, old, very human story. So let us go there now. Slowly. Together. Le Bon called him the meneur, the leader, not necessarily a general or a king or a man with a title. The meneur could be anyone, a voice at the front of the crowd, a pamphleteer, an orator, a face on a poster. What made him a meneur was not his office or his intelligence. What made him the leader was one thing, and one thing alone. Prestige, prestige. Le Bon used the word carefully, and it is worth pausing on it, because it does not mean what we sometimes assume. He did not mean fame, exactly, or even beauty or power in the legal sense. Prestige, as Le Bon described it, is a kind of spell. It is the quality that prevents a crowd from asking questions. When prestige is working, the follower does not examine the leader, does not weigh the argument, does not hold the claim up to the light to see if it holds. The spell makes examination feel, and this is the precise, strange word, unnecessary, even insulting. As if the very act of doubting the prestige figure is itself a small moral failure, a disloyalty, a betrayal of the self that chose to follow. There are two kinds of prestige, Le Bon said. Acquired prestige comes from a name, a rank, a reputation built over time. A famous general, a revered professor, a title that arrives before the person does, so that the crowd has already formed its feeling before the first word is spoken. Acquired prestige can be lost, a single public failure, a revelation, a fall, and when it breaks completely, faster than it built. And then there is personal prestige. Harder to explain, it does not depend on title or achievement, it is carried in the body, in the certainty of the voice, in what Le Bon described as a kind of fascination, an animal quality of presence, that certain rare people exert that makes the crowd feel in their vicinity that something important is happening, something necessary, Personal prestige is more durable than acquired prestige because there is no logical argument that can dismantle it. You cannot reason someone out of a feeling. The meneur in Le Bon's account does not succeed by logic. The crowd cannot follow logic. He had already established this, that they think in images, not in chains of deduction. The meneur succeeds by filling the crowd with an image and a feeling, and then making those two things feel like certainty. And the way he does this, the precise, step-by-step recipe Le Bon laid out in 1895, is where this part of the story gets very quiet and very serious. The first step is affirmation. Not an argument, not a proof, not even an explanation. Just a flat, bold statement, made as if its truth is so self-evident that debating it would be faintly absurd. A single, vivid, confident sentence. The enemies of the people. The nation is in danger. We alone can fix it. The statement does not invite examination because it does not present itself as a position to be examined. It presents itself as the floor. The thing you stand on before you decide what to think about anything else. Le Bon was clear about this. The affirmation must be brief. It must be free of any reasoning or proof. The moment you begin to reason, you have already lost the crowd. Because reason forces the crowd to think, and the crowd is not in the mode of thinking. It is in the mode of feeling and being convinced. The affirmation feeds that mode directly, without the friction of an argument. The second step is repetition. The same statement again and again, without variation, without the embarrassment a thoughtful person might feel about saying the same thing twice without new evidence. Le Bon understood, and this is one of the places where 1895 reaches all the way forward into your own life. Into your own nervous system. He understood that repetition does something specific to belief, something almost physiological. The first time you hear an assertion, your mind can hold it at arm's length. The second time, the distance closes slightly. The fifth time, the 10th time, the statement begins to feel familiar, and familiar begins to feel true. Not because any evidence has arrived, because the repetition has worn a groove. The assertion has entered what Le Bon called, using the language of his era, the unconscious, the place beneath deliberate thought, where beliefs live not as conclusions, but as bedrock. Modern neuroscience would recognize this. We call it the illusory truth effect. Things heard more frequently are rated as more true, even when the person rating them knows they were initially uncertain. The repetition does not make something true, it makes it feel true. Those are not the same thing. But in the moment, inside the crowd, they are nearly impossible to tell apart. The third step is contagion. Once the affirmation has been repeated enough that the early believers hold it with fervour, it spreads. Not through argument, nobody convinces the next person by marshalling evidence. It spreads the way Le Bon described contagion from the beginning, person to person, like a disease through a room with poor ventilation. The new believer catches the belief from the atmosphere of certainty around them, from the expressions on the faces, from the chanted phrase that is already in the air. From the feeling, and here is the particular danger, that everyone else seems already convinced, which means that being unconvinced begins to feel like personal strangeness, like isolation, like being the one who is wrong. The crowd's contagion is not persuasion, it is pressure dressed as consensus. And the fourth step, the fourth element that Le Bon identified and named, is prestige. The leader's prestige does not just start the chain, it sustains it. It gives the whole machine a face, a voice, an object for the crowd's feeling to attach itself to. The crowd needs something to look toward. The leader provides that. And the leader's continued certainty, the quality that does not waver even when challenged, that even raises its volume when pressed, the crowd reads this as proof. Not proof that the argument is correct. Proof that the person speaking is the kind of person who knows. The two are not the same. But inside the crowd's logic, they are not distinguishable. Affirmation, repetition, contagion, prestige, 4 steps. Written down in Paris in 1895. And if you have been paying attention to the world, to the way any movement forms and hardens and turns on those who question it, you will have recognized at least one of these steps from this morning, possibly all 4. Take a slow breath here. There is no rush. Let this settle gently, the way a stone settles through water, slowly, without force. The words will still be here when you are ready. Now let us stay with Le Bon for a moment, because he has just given us a recipe, and it is worth pausing on what kind of recipe it is. It is not a recipe for evil, exactly. It is a recipe for persuasion at scale. And what is poured through it depends entirely on who is pouring. The same 4 steps can drive a crowd toward cruelty, or toward courage, toward a burning building, or toward the people trapped inside it. The recipe does not care. The recipe works regardless of the direction. But Le Bon was not naive about what it was most often used for, and he was not neutral about what he feared. He lived in a France that had seen the revolutionary crowds of the Terror, those weeks in 1793 and 1794, when the guillotine ran almost daily, when the crowd's hunger for enemies had swallowed even the revolution's own leaders. He was 30 years old during the Paris Commune of 1871, the terrifying uprising when workers seized the capital for 2 months. When barricades went up in the streets and the city burned, and somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people were killed in the final week of suppression. Le Bon was there practicing medicine. He saw what a crowd in the streets, armed and anonymous and certain, looked like from the inside. This is where it helps to understand not just what Le Bon wrote, but why he wrote it when he wrote it. Because Psychologie des Foules, the crowd, did not appear from nowhere. It appeared in 1895 in a France that had extended the vote to all adult men, where industrial cities were filling with workers who were beginning to organize, where socialist movements were gaining real political weight, where the very shape of society was shifting towards something the educated professional class found alarming. Le Bon opened the book by declaring, in words that still have a quiet thunder to them, that the world had entered the era of crowds, that the unconscious activities of crowds had replaced the conscious activities of individuals as the force that shaped history, that the voice of the masses had become decisive in a way it had never before been. He was right in the descriptive sense. Universal male suffrage was real, the mass movements were real. The power of collective action and collective rage was not a fantasy. And if you hear in his words a certain elite anxiety about what happens when everyone gets a vote, a certain reactionary distress at the masses entering the stage, you are not wrong. Le Bon's politics were deeply conservative. His book was, among other things, a brilliant and deeply worried response from an educated man who found the new democratic century frightening. His broader writings contain scientific racism and a condescension toward women that the century following has rightly and thoroughly rejected. He was not a hero. He was a man of his class and his moment, with all the particular blindnesses that entailed. But his observations, not his politics, his observations about what happens inside a crowd, struck something true enough that they survived long past their moment. They caught the attention of people who were themselves very serious about the question. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. Sigmund Freud, who was not a man given to loose praise, read Le Bon's book and called the description of crowd psychology brilliantly executed. When Freud published, in 1921, his own group psychology and the analysis of the ego, Massenpsychologie und Ich-Analyse, in the original German, he opened by quoting Le Bon at length. Pages of it. He walked through the three engines, the contagion, the suggestibility, the loss of individual responsibility, the crowd's preference for images over logic. He agreed with much of it. He took it seriously in the way you only take seriously something that seems to be describing something real. And then he said, something is missing. Le Bon had described what the crowd does. He had named the mechanisms with real precision. But he had not explained what holds it together. What is the glue? What is the actual force that causes a group of separate individuals to become, in their subjective experience, a single thing? Freud's answer was the leader. But not the leader as Le Bon had described him, not just as a prestige figure projecting certainty. Freud added something Le Bon had left mostly unexplained: the emotional bond. The libidinal tie, in Freud's language. The followers in a group are bound to each other, Freud argued, because they share something. They have each placed the same person, the leader, the idea, the institution, in the position of their ego ideal, their interior standard of who they want to be. When many people do this with the same object, they find themselves, almost without knowing why, deeply identified with each other. They feel like kin. They feel, with sudden warmth, that the person next to them, someone they did not know an hour ago, is essentially themselves. And this feeling of kinship is not incidental, it is the fuel. The leader does not just stand at the front and project certainty. The leader is, in Freud's account, the object the crowd has agreed to love. And the crowd's love for that shared object is what transforms a collection of strangers into the psychological entity Le Bon described: a single mind, a single feeling, a single will. Freud's addition matters. It explains something Le Bon's mechanism alone cannot fully account for: why the crowd is so defensive of the leader, even when the leader fails. Why evidence against the leader lands not as information but as attack. Why questioning the leader feels to the believer like an assault on themselves. Because it is, in a psychological sense. If you have placed the leader in the position of your ego ideal, then attacking the leader is attacking the best version of who you believe you are. The defense is not irrational. It is a person protecting a part of themselves that they may not even know they have extended outward. That is Freud's addition. One small piece, added in 1921, that makes the original machine comprehensible in a new way. And then there is Edward Bernays, who read Le Bon and read Freud. Bernays was in fact Freud's nephew by marriage and corresponded with him, and who in 1923 published Crystallizing Public Opinion, and in 1928 published Propaganda, and in those two books did something that Le Bon himself had not quite done. He turned the crowd mechanism into a professional practice, into an industry. Bernays is credited, not entirely happily, as the father of public relations. What he saw, reading Le Bon and Freud, was not a warning. Or rather, he saw a warning, and decided that someone was going to use this knowledge regardless, so it might as well be used skillfully, and by the right people. The masses, he argued in propaganda, are moved not by facts but by symbols and emotions. Effective persuasion works not through rational argument addressed to the individual, but through appealing to group identifications, shared desires, the images that carry feeling rather than information. He was describing, in different language, Le Bon's affirmation, repetition, contagion, prestige toolkit, but now dressed in the clothes of business and politics and the management of consent. Bernays went on to engineer some of the most effective public opinion campaigns of the 20th century. He convinced Americans that cigarettes were a symbol of women's liberation. He helped reshape the image of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. He applied, in deliberate, professional ways, the mechanics that Le Bon had observed in street crowds, but now at the scale of entire publics. Without a square or a rally, without anyone knowing they were being moved the way a crowd was moved. That is a particular kind of genius, and a particular kind of horror. And it runs in a direct line from the book written in 1895 by the anxious French physician watching the masses enter the stage. The darker line of that inheritance is the one that requires the most care to describe. Le Bon's book was read widely, and by many people. Some of them were politicians, some of them were theorists of the new mass media of the early 20th century, the photograph, the cinema, the radio, the stadium rally. In the years between the wars, as Europe began its long catastrophic slide toward fascism, several of the most effective architects of mass persuasion were conversant with Le Bon's vocabulary. Mussolini praised the crowd. He reportedly spoke of it with admiration. The affirmation, repetition, contagion mechanics of fascist propaganda, the slogan shouted until it bypassed thought. The image of the leader projected onto enormous screens, the crowd's own noise fed back to itself until the feeling of certainty became overwhelming. These were not accidental. They were engineered. And the engineering drew from a tradition that Le Bon had helped map. The claim that Hitler himself read Le Bon and studied him directly is reported widely and repeated in many places. But the specific documentation is harder than the confidence of the claim suggests. Treat it as widely cited rather than definitively established. What is clear, what scholars of propaganda and of the Third Reich have documented, is that the techniques bore a striking structural resemblance to Le Bon's recipe, whether or not they arrived through that particular reading. Affirmation without proof, relentless repetition, contagion through spectacle, prestige constructed through ritual and physical staging. A crowd told to think in images and given a single image to think in, endlessly, the mechanism Le Bon described ran through those decades like a current through a wire, and the scale of the destruction it carried is not a metaphor. This is where Le Bon's book becomes something more than a clever period observation. This is where it becomes a document that must be read carefully and seriously. Not because Le Bon was right about everything, he was not, and the modern science will correct him in important ways, but because the mechanism he identified was real enough that people who wanted to move masses at scale used it as something close to an operating manual. The masses, Le Bon wrote, have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduce them. It is an ungenerous sentence. Le Bon could be deeply uncharitable toward the people he was describing. But strip away the contempt, and what is left is a serious observation about a real phenomenon, that human beings in the state of crowd feeling are not primarily in the mode of wanting to know what is actually true. They are in the mode of wanting to feel confirmed, to feel together, to feel that the image they have adopted is the correct one, and a leader or a system that gives them that feeling, even at the cost of accuracy, will consistently outcompete one that offers accurate information wrapped in the uncomfortable request to think slowly and tolerate uncertainty. Le Bon wrote that in 1895, and then the 20th century arrived and demonstrated it repeatedly, at great cost. But here is where something important needs to be said, something that the most useful reading of Le Bon demands. The history we have just walked through, the propaganda and the rallies and the manufactured consent, this was not exclusively a story about some other kind of people. It was not a story about the uniquely gullible, or the poorly educated, or the populations of some other country, some other era. Stanley Milgram, who in 1961 began the obedience experiments in New Haven, ordinary American men, recruited through a newspaper ad, found that a majority of them, when an authority figure in a laboratory coat instructed them to continue, administered what they believed were severe and dangerous electric shocks to another person. Let that land slowly, the way a slow thing lands. Ordinary men, not cruel, not disturbed, not members of any mob or extremist movement, sitting alone in a room, one-on-one with a scientist in a white coat, no crowd around them, no anonymity of numbers, no contagion from adjacent bodies. And still, a majority of them kept pressing the button, kept delivering what the machine labelled as 200 volts, 250, 300, because a voice with prestige, a calm, steady, authoritative voice, told them to continue. The actor behind the partition was screaming, begging them to stop, complaining of a heart condition, falling silent, and most of them continued. Milgram's original experiments ran from 1961 to 1963. He found, across multiple variations, that roughly 65% of subjects, and sometimes more depending on the setup, went all the way to the maximum voltage level on the machine. The one labelled, in capital letters, danger, severe shock. The mechanism Le Bon had named, prestige, the authority's aura that short-circuits individual moral judgment, was not exclusive to mobs. It worked on individuals, alone, without a crowd, without numbers to hide in, just one person and one authority and the instruction to continue. The crowd, it turns out, is not even necessary. The mechanisms work on individuals too. They work anywhere that the features Le Bon identified, the presence of authority, the removal of felt responsibility, the suggestion that this is normal, this is expected, this is what is being done, converge on a single person in a single moment. The crowd is a space where those features are dense and mutually reinforcing. But each feature can operate independently of the rest. That is a sobering thought to carry into the dark with you, not as a cause for despair, as a reason to look more carefully. Milgram himself was shaken by his results. He had not expected what he found. He had consulted with colleagues and psychiatrists before the experiments, and they had predicted that virtually no one, perhaps 1%, would go all the way to the maximum level. They were wrong by a factor of 60. The ordinary American man, they had assumed, would exercise independent moral judgment at the point where the evidence of harm was clear. He did not. Most of the time. He continued, because the authority said continue. Milgram spent the rest of his career trying to understand this, and one of the things he identified was a concept he called the agentic state. The shift that happens, and this connects directly back to Le Bon, when a person stops experiencing themselves as an autonomous moral agent and begins to experience themselves as an instrument of an authority. Their attention narrows. The question of whether what they are doing is right recedes, replaced by the narrower question of whether they are executing the authority's instruction correctly. The morality of the action is, in their subjective experience, delegated upward. The authority is responsible. The individual is just the mechanism. This is Le Bon's lost sense of responsibility applied to an individual, alone, under authority. The feeling of being part of something larger, a crowd, an institution, an instruction, and the way that feeling migrates the sense of responsibility away from the self. The crowd does this at scale. Authority does it in a room with one person. The underlying mechanism appears to be the same. And here is where the historical context and the psychological mechanism begin to speak to each other in a way that is impossible to ignore. Le Bon was watching the crowd in the streets of Paris, the mass movements, the era of crowds as he called it. Milgram was watching a single person in a laboratory. And they were both, from their different vantage points, watching the same human capacity. The capacity to hand over moral agency to something outside the self and to act from that place without the full weight of individual conscience bearing down on the action. This is not a feature of weak or stupid people. Milgram's subjects were ordinary. Asch's subjects were bright college students who could see perfectly well that the lines were different lengths. The mechanisms do not sort by intelligence, they sort by context. By the presence or absence of the specific features, prestige, anonymity, numbers, contagion, the felt certainty of a surrounding consensus that together create the conditions in which individual judgment becomes unreliable. And this is the point in the night where Le Bon's 1895 book, read carefully, becomes not a historical curiosity about 19th century street mobs, but something that is asking you a very current, very personal question. Take a breath. Let your body settle a little heavier. You do not need to do anything with any of this tonight. You are just listening, letting it move through. The words will carry it. The question the book is asking, the question that the entire lineage from Le Bon through Freud, through Bernays, through Milgram, is building toward is this. Not, are there crowds out there that lose their minds? We know the answer to that. Yes, obviously history is full of them. Not, can the crowd be manipulated by a demagogue with the right toolkit? We know that too. The question is, where are you in this picture? Because the 1895 book and the century of research it generated and the lineage of propaganda and public relations that it fed, none of it is only about other people. None of it is only about the torchlit mob or the stadium rally or the movements of long-dead masses. It is about the conditions under which any person, any intelligent, thoughtful, well-meaning person becomes susceptible to exactly the mechanisms Le Bon described. And that brings us, gently but directly, to a moment where the story of what Le Bon got right has to make room for the story of what he got wrong. Not to be kind to him, exactly, but because the correction is where the real insight lives, where the usable understanding is. Because if Le Bon's picture of the crowd is fully accurate, then there is no defense. If the crowd genuinely dissolves individual intelligence and replaces it with a barbarian's instinct, then your only protection is to never stand in a crowd, never join a movement, never participate in collective action, never be part of a group that feels, for a moment, like a shared identity. But the modern science does not say that. And the people who have spent their careers actually studying crowds, not from an anxious Parisian salon, but in Bristol in 1980, and in the field, and in the laboratory, tell a more complicated and more useful story. And that is where we are going next. Slowly into the correction. Into what it actually means that you never really lose your mind in a crowd, that something more specific and more navigable happens instead. Something you can, with the right knowledge and the right attention, actually see. But the night is long. And there is no hurry at all. Rest here for a moment if you want to. Feel the weight of the blanket, the quiet that has been building in the room while all of this has been unfolding. The history and the mechanisms and the long chain of minds that have tried to understand this one strange feature of human life. The way we become different together than we are alone, all of it can settle now. Like sediment through water, finding its place in the dark without any effort from you. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice what has softened while you were resting. The room, the quiet, the way the body grows heavier when the mind is given permission to stop arriving at conclusions and simply receive. You do not need to hold any of what we have covered tonight. The ideas are not going anywhere. They will be where you left them in the morning, patient and unchanged. When you are ready, we will continue together. The correction begins in a place called St. Paul's. Not the cathedral in London, though this story too is about something becoming visible that had previously been hidden. St. Paul's is a neighbourhood in Bristol, England, in the spring of 1980. And what happened there on the 2nd of April in that year would eventually help dismantle something that Le Bon had constructed, not with an argument exactly, but with something more difficult to dismiss. Evidence, the kind that comes from watching what people actually do rather than theorizing from a salon about what they must do. What happened in St. Paul's in 1980 was a riot, and from a distance, from the outside, it looked like exactly the thing Le Bon had described. A crowd, a breakdown of order, violence spreading through the streets, the police retreating, barriers burning. Everything that a person reading the crowd for the first time would look at and say, yes, this is it. This is the barbarian acting by instinct. The civilized individual dissolved back into something older and less restrained. But a researcher named Stephen Riker was paying a different kind of attention. Riker, along with his colleagues John Drury and Clifford Stott, was not interested in confirming what everyone already believed about crowds. He was interested in what the crowd was actually doing, not the headline, the texture, the specifics of what was targeted, what was not targeted, what norms seemed to be operating inside the event, even as the event looked from outside like the absence of norms. And what he found was this. The violence in St. Paul's was not random. It was not, as Le Bon would have predicted, a general eruption of barbarian instinct directed at anything within reach. It was patterned. Selective, the people in that crowd were making distinctions, active, real distinctions, about what fell inside the logic of the event and what did not. Police and symbols of state authority were targets. Local residents, local property, people who were clearly part of the community were not. Cars belonging to neighbours were left untouched. Windows of community shops were left unbroken. There was something operating in that crowd that looked, from close enough, not like the absence of reason, but like a different set of reasons. What Riker's work gave to social science was a framework. He and his colleagues called it the social identity model of de-individuation effects. The name is less important than the idea inside it. Here it is, as simply as it can be said. When you join a crowd, when you become for a moment part of a collective, you do not lose your identity. You shift it. You move from thinking of yourself as an individual with your particular name, your particular history, your particular web of private loyalties and private judgments, to thinking of yourself as a member, as someone whose defining characteristic right now is the thing you share with the people around you. And in that shift, you do not stop reasoning, you do not stop following norms, you start following different ones. The norms of the group you have now, temporarily, become. This is the correction. This is what Le Bon missed. He saw the individual reasoning disappear, and he assumed that all reasoning had disappeared. What he did not see, could not see from where he was standing, was that a different kind of reasoning had filled the space. A reasoning that said, "What is this group? What are we about? Right now? In this moment? What would a member of this group do?" And the answer to that last question is not always violence. It is not always cruelty. It is not always, as Le Bon assumed, a regression toward the primitive. It depends entirely on the identity that has been adopted, and the norms that identity carries. A crowd of paramedics rushing toward a collapsed building does not descend the ladder of civilization. A crowd of protesters protecting a wounded stranger from further harm does not descend the ladder of civilization. What those crowds do is reason rapidly and collectively about what membership in that group right now requires, and they act accordingly. This is not a small adjustment to Le Bon's theory. It is a replacement of the most central part of it. He said, "The crowd takes a civilized person and makes them a barbarian." The research says the crowd takes a person and makes them, very quickly, a particular kind of member. And what that member does depends entirely on the kind of group they have joined. You are not mindless in a crowd. You have been re-identified. The difference matters. It matters enormously. Because if you are mindless, there is nothing to be done. If you have been re-identified, there is a door. There is a gap between the new identity and your actual self through which attention can travel, if you know to look for it. We will come back to that door. But first, let us meet another set of ideas that arrived roughly around the same time as Riker was beginning his work. Ideas that reach a similar conclusion from a different direction. Ralph Turner and Louis Killian, two American sociologists who were thinking carefully about how crowds behave, developed what they called emergent norm theory. And the name tells you nearly everything. Their argument was this: crowds are not controlled by a pre-existing hive mind, and they are not simply the irrational surging of base instinct. What they are is this: groups of people in unusual, ambiguous situations, situations where the normal rules do not obviously apply, improvise, they watch each other, they read each other. And gradually, through a process that is partly deliberate and partly just the social animal doing what the social animal does, new norms emerge. A crowd does not arrive with its rules already written. It writes them on the fly, in real time, out of what each person observes the others doing or appearing to be about to do. Turner and Killian described this first in 1957 and developed it further in 1972. The detail that makes the theory bite is this: once a norm emerges, people who are not entirely sure about it will often simply conform. Not because they have lost their minds, because conformity in ambiguous situations is a deeply rational survival strategy. When you do not know the rules, following what seems to be the majority behavior is usually safer than inventing your own. And so, behavior that might have started with a small number of instigators, the people most committed, most activated, most clear about what they are doing, can spread through a crowd not because everyone else has been infected with a barbarian contagion, but because everyone else is watching, reading uncertainty as permission. Which means the crowd's behavior is not the lowest common denominator of every member's deepest instinct. It is an improvised social contract drafted under pressure in real time that people sign on to partly because they do not fully know what else to do. This is a more forgiving picture than Le Bon's. And it is also, in a strange way, a more frightening one. Because it means the direction a crowd takes is not destiny. It is contingent. It depends on who acts first and most visibly. It depends on what behavior gets read as the norm early in the event. It depends on whether the first clear signal is toward violence or toward de-escalation, toward destruction or toward protection. The crowd that follows is not inevitable. It is responsive. And that means the people most responsible for where it ends up are often not the majority. They are the first few who act with enough clarity and confidence to define what this gathering is. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. Now, there is a piece of history that belongs here. Something that shaped the popular understanding of crowds and anonymity for decades, and that also serves as a cautionary note about how science can be misread when it confirms what we already want to believe. In 1971, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo ran what became known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. The setup has become so famous it is almost mythological. A mock prison in a university basement. Students randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners. The experiment had to be stopped after 6 days because the guards had become, it seemed, genuinely cruel, dehumanizing the prisoners, abusing the power of their role in ways that appeared to confirm everything Le Bon had said about the dissolving of individual restraint under the cover of role and anonymity and institutional permission. The experiment travelled through popular culture like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples touching everything. It was cited, and cited again, and cited again, as proof that ordinary people in the right conditions will become monsters. That the role, the uniform, the anonymity, the authority structure, that these things reach inside the individual and bring out the barbarian. But there is something important to say here, and it is worth saying quietly and carefully. The Stanford Prison Experiment is no longer accepted as clean scientific proof of anything. Researchers who went back to examine what actually happened, who read the original recordings, interviewed the participants years later, studied the methodology, found serious problems. Guards had reportedly been coached by Zimbardo himself about how to behave. Demand characteristics, the psychological term for participants doing what they think the experimenter wants, seem to have shaped the behavior from early on. The experiment was not a controlled scientific study of human nature. It was closer to an improvised performance that escalated in a direction that confirmed its author's hypothesis. This does not mean nothing happened. It does not mean the pressures of role and authority and anonymity are unreal. Milgram demonstrated those pressures through more careful methods. Dina's Halloween children are still quietly relevant. The mechanisms Le Bon described are real enough in their broad strokes, even when his framing is wrong. But the Stanford Prison Experiment specifically is not the evidence it was claimed to be, and treating it as such, citing it as proof that humans are a thin membrane away from becoming sadists, is borrowing credibility from something that did not earn it. Science does this sometimes. It produces a compelling story that the culture grabs onto before the careful checking has had time to catch up. And then the compelling story lives in the world long after the checking has found the cracks. The crowd, in a sense, decided that the Stanford prison experiment proved what crowds are like, without quite reading the evidence carefully enough to notice that it did not. There is something wry about that. Or perhaps more than wry. Let us breathe here a moment. Notice the quiet. The way the body has settled further into the bed while the mind has been following these threads. There is no need to hold the exact sequence of these names and dates. The shape of the thing is what matters. The arc, the correction Le Bon needed, and how long it took to arrive, and how much the corrected picture actually changes what you can do with the knowledge. When you are ready, we will continue. Now the nuance that most popular treatments of Le Bon entirely forget. He wrote, and this is easy to miss when the book is used primarily as a handbook for understanding mob violence, he wrote that crowds are capable of great heroism, of extraordinary self-sacrifice, of a kind of disinterested devotion that the isolated individual rarely achieves. He was not saying that the crowd only degrades, he was saying the crowd amplifies. And amplification is not a direction. It is a force. You can amplify kindness as easily as cruelty. You can amplify courage as easily as cowardice. What you cannot do is leave the amplitude unchanged. The crowd presses the volume up. What plays through the speakers depends on what was playing before the volume was raised. Think of the stories that come down to us from disasters. The passengers who formed lines, helped strangers first, passed children through windows, the bystanders who ran toward a collapsed building rather than away from it, the crowds at moments of collective grief, the flowers left in public squares, the strangers holding each other, that demonstrate a kind of warmth and solidarity that ordinary private life almost never produces at the same intensity. These are crowds too. These are the same mechanisms Le Bon described. Contagion, but now what spreads is not panic but calm, not cruelty but care, suggestibility. But what the crowd is made susceptible to is the example of the person who stopped to help, the person who did not run, the person who turned back. Numbers, but the feeling of invincible power they produce, is used not to erase responsibility, but to magnify the sense that something collective can be accomplished, that the situation is not hopeless, that enough hands make a weight manageable. The crowd is a lens that focuses, and a lens that focuses light can illuminate or it can start a fire. The same mechanics, the same physics, entirely different outcomes. This is the nuance that makes Le Bon useful rather than merely pessimistic. Because if the crowd were simply a mechanism for degradation, the only rational response would be withdrawal, refusal, the lone individual standing apart, maintaining their cultivated independence at all costs, watching from a safe distance. But if the crowd is an amplifier that swings both ways, if it can amplify the best impulse as easily as the worst, then participation is not simply a risk. It is also, potentially, an opportunity. The question is what you bring into it, and whether you have the attention to notice when the amplification is running in the wrong direction. We will come to that attention now. We will come to the modern map, and then to the door. Because it is one thing to understand Le Bon in Bristol in 1980 and in the laboratories of Solomon Asch and Stanley Milgram and Edward Diener. It is another thing entirely to look up from those historical examples and notice where the same mechanisms are running right now, at this moment, in the world you actually live in. Stanley Cohen wrote a book in 1972 called Folk Devils and Moral Panics. The title sounds almost quaint, but what it describes is immediate and recognizable. Cohen was studying how societies respond to perceived threats, specifically how that response can become grotesquely disproportionate, fueled not by the actual scale of the danger, but by the crowd dynamics of collective fear and the identification of a scapegoat. The folk devil is whoever the crowd has decided to make the target, the source of all anxiety. The figure onto whom a society's complicated fears get projected in simplified, demonizing form. The moral panic is the collective emotional state that makes this possible. A state in which the usual channels of sober evaluation are bypassed, in which affirmation and repetition and contagion do their work, in which anyone who suggests the panic might be disproportionate risks being absorbed into the category of the folk devil themselves. Cohen was writing about specific social events, youth subcultures, the mods and rockers of 1960s Britain, but the pattern he identified was ancient. The witch trial is a moral panic. The Red Scare is a moral panic. The mechanisms are Le Bon's mechanisms, contagion spreading through a large group, reason giving way to vivid images, the crowd reinforcing in each of its members the certainty that the threat is real and that deviation from the collective judgment is betrayal rather than discernment. What Cohen added that Le Bon did not fully see was the role of what Cohen called the moral entrepreneurs. The figures who benefit from the panic, who cultivate it, who define and circulate the image of the folk devil. The demagogue, in Le Bon's vocabulary, but more specifically, in Cohen's, the people who control how the story gets told, the institutions and voices that get to name the threat and amplify the fear. Because here is the thing about a moral panic. It does not need everyone to believe it. It needs enough contagion to make skepticism feel socially costly. To make the person who asks, "But is this actually proportionate?" feel like they are defending the folk devil, like they have revealed themselves as a danger rather than a septic. The social pressure of the crowd does not require physical presence. It requires the sense, accurately or not, that the group has already decided and that the cost of dissent is exclusion. Which brings us to the place where all of this is most alive right now. Not the square, not the stadium, not even the salon where Le Bon served his Wednesday lunches and watched anxiously as the masses entered politics. The feed. You have been scrolling something today. A timeline, a dashboard, a collection of signals from hundreds or thousands of other minds, filtered and sorted and amplified by an algorithm whose only objective is engagement, which is to say, whose only objective is to keep you looking. And what keeps people looking, as the MIT study from 2018 measured with a precision Le Bon could never have imagined, is novelty and emotion. Not truth, not accuracy, not proportion, novelty and emotion. Soroush Vasofi, Deb Roy and Sinan Aral analyzed roughly 126,000 stories shared on Twitter. True stories and false ones. And what they found was this: false news spread significantly farther, faster, and deeper than true news. False stories were about 70% more likely to be retweeted. And the truth, when it eventually arrived, took about 6 times as long to reach 500 people as the false story had taken to reach the same number. 6 times as long. What drove the false news faster was not that people were stupid or malicious. What drove it was that it was newer, more surprising, more emotionally arousing. Specifically, the emotions it triggered most were disgust and surprise. The same vivid, simple, striking images that Le Bon said crowds think in are exactly what the algorithm selects for, automatically, at scale, billions of times a day. The feed is not neutral. It is a machine for crowd dynamics, for contagion without geography, for suggestibility at the speed of light. The online pile-on is a psychological crowd. It has no physical location. You can participate in it lying in bed, alone in a quiet room, never having spoken to any of the other participants, never having touched a single stranger, never having chanted a slogan or raised a hand. But the mechanics are identical to what Le Bon described in 1895. The sense of numbers, the counter that shows how many people have said this thing, liked this post, shared this condemnation. The contagion, the cascade of responses, each one making the next more likely. The snowball that builds its own momentum. The anonymity, the username rather than the name. The avatar rather than the face. The dissolution of personal responsibility into the general will of the thread. The vivid image, the worst possible interpretation of someone's words or actions, stripped of context, circulated as an obvious truth that needs no argument because the crowd has already decided. And the affirmation, repetition, contagion triad, the 1895 demagogue's toolkit running at machine speed. The same claim stated simply and without proof, hundreds of times, until it has entered the consciousness of the crowd as accepted fact. Until the people who had not previously thought about it at all are retweeting it as settled. Until dissent feels not like skepticism, but like alliance with the enemy. The bank run belongs here too. When news that a bank is in trouble reaches depositors, regardless of whether the bank is actually in trouble, enough depositors withdrawing their funds to be safe is itself the mechanism that makes the bank fail. The fear makes itself true. This is not a new phenomenon. Banks have failed this way for centuries. But in the digital age, the contagion moves faster than the institution can respond to. The crowd does not need to gather in the street, it needs to open an app. The same dynamics, the sense of numbers, the contagion of alarm, the suggestibility of an ambiguous moment produce the same outcome in the same amount of time. The meme stock manias work the same way. A loosely connected group of people, anonymous to each other, sharing a simple, powerful image. This stock, this company, this symbol of something, and the affirmation of belonging to the group becomes itself a driver of behavior. Not because the underlying analysis is sound, because the crowd has decided, and the crowd's decision feeds back into the price, and the price feeds back into the crowd's certainty, and the loop runs until it breaks. Le Bon did not see any of this specifically. He could not. But he described the architecture, and the architecture runs exactly as he drew it, only faster, only wider, only with algorithms specifically designed to optimize for the emotional states that make a person most susceptible to the contagion. He declared the era of crowds in 1895. He had not seen anything yet. Rest here if you want. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the big picture settle. The history of the idea. The modern scale of it. The fact that the crowd that matters most in your life right now probably has no physical location at all. It is a psychological crowd, a shared mental state, distributed across 1 million screens. And you are in it more often than you might think. You do not need to solve any of this tonight. You only need to know where we are going. When you are ready, we will come to the door. The door, the last thing and the most useful thing, and the reason this is not simply a history lesson, but something you can actually use. Le Bon's original picture of the crowd was, in a strange way, paralyzing. If the crowd dissolves individual intelligence and replaces it with barbarian instinct, there is no play. You either avoid crowds entirely, or you accept that inside one you are no longer really yourself. You are the barbarian. You are the creature acting by instinct. And since the online crowd is inescapable, this picture would mean that large portions of your mental life are simply lost to forces beyond your reach. But that is not what is happening. What is happening, as Riker's work showed, is a shift of identity. You move from personal identity to group identity, and you begin to reason according to the norms of the group rather than your own private judgment. And that is navigable, because it is a shift that can be observed from the inside if you know what you are looking for. These are the tells, these are the signs that the shift has happened and you are reasoning as the crowd rather than as yourself. The first is certainty that arrived very fast. Real intellectual positions, arrived at through genuine reasoning, tend to be accompanied by some residual doubt. You have thought it through, you believe it, but you also hold the awareness that you might be missing something. When the certainty feels total, when there is no doubt at all, when the other position seems not just wrong but obviously wrong, almost incomprehensibly wrong, and when that certainty arrived in a matter of seconds while you were scrolling, that speed is worth noticing. Certainty at scroll speed is almost never the product of individual reasoning. It is the product of contagion. The second is the feeling that dissent is betrayal. When you find yourself thinking, not "I disagree with that argument, but how could anyone say that?" When the wrong opinion feels like a moral failure on the part of the person holding it rather than simply an error, when the question, "but what if they have a point?" feels like a small act of disloyalty, you are reasoning as the crowd. The crowd cannot tolerate doubt. Individual reasoning can. If doubt feels dangerous, that is the crowd's intolerance running through you. The third is the slogan you are repeating that you did not choose. When you find yourself using a phrase that everyone in the group is using, a formulation, a framing, a specific word choice that has become the marker of right membership, and you realize you adopted it without consciously examining whether you actually agree with what it implies. That is the affirmation-repetition triad at work. You did not decide to say it. The crowd decided, and you followed, and then it felt like your own. The fourth is that you have stopped looking for evidence against your position, not because you considered it and found it wanting, because the thought of looking for it does not arise, because the position feels so obviously correct that counter-evidence would not even be credible, it would be, by definition, suspect. This is what Le Bon meant when he said crowds cannot follow a chain of reasoning. Not that they are stupid, that they have foreclosed, that the conclusion is prior to the evidence. These are the tells. And now the countermeasures. 4 of them. Real ones, grounded in what the research shows actually works. The first is repersonalization. Restore your name to yourself. This sounds almost absurdly simple, but the mechanism of anonymity that Dina's Halloween children demonstrated is real and reversible. The child who was asked for their name before reaching into the candy bowl took less candy than the anonymous child in the group. The mechanism that erases responsibility requires the absence of individuation. So restore it. Before you act, before you post, before you share, before you join the pile, ask yourself, if my name and my face were attached to this, is this what I would say? If the answer changes the behavior, the anonymity was doing something. The second is slowing the affirmation repetition loop. The triad's power comes from speed, assertion moving fast enough through the system that the verification step never has time to run. The countermeasure is simply to introduce delay. Not forever, just long enough for the reasoning to catch up with the certainty. 24 hours between reading a headline and sharing it. The actual length of time needed to find one primary source. The practice of asking, once before repeating anything, where does this claim actually come from? Not who posted it. Not how many others have shared it. Where does it come from? Contagion cannot survive that question if you actually wait for the answer. The third is demanding the reasoning behind the image. Le Bon said crowds think in images, not in logic. The image is vivid and emotionally compelling and requires no argument because it lands directly on the feeling before the reasoning can get there. The countermeasure is to ask for the argument. Not to reject the image, but to demand that it be accompanied by a chain of logic that can be followed. What is the claim, precisely? What is the evidence for it? What would count as evidence against it? If those questions cannot be answered, if the image dissolves under that pressure without an argument having been made, then the image was doing all the work, and you know to hold more loosely. The fourth is the one Solomon Asch showed us, and it is the most counterintuitive and the most hopeful. Remember the experiment, students in a room. Confederates giving obviously wrong answers about the lengths of lines. About 75% of subjects conformed to the wrong answer at least once. About a third of total responses followed the wrong majority. The power of social pressure over individual perception demonstrated with what is almost unbearable clarity. But Asch ran a variation. He gave the subject an ally, one other person in the room, one Confederate who broke from the group and gave the correct answer. And when there was a single dissenter, a single person who said aloud what the subject privately knew to be true, the conformity rate collapsed. Dramatically, the presence of one other person who refused to follow the crowd was enough to give the subject permission to refuse as well. One, not a movement, not a majority, not an organized counter-crowd. One person who said a different thing. This is the most important piece of practical knowledge in the entire evening's conversation. You do not need to defeat the crowd's reasoning. You do not need to change everyone's mind. You do not need to be particularly brave or articulate or confident. You only need to be the one. The person who says, quietly, I am not sure about this. The person who asks, gently, where does this come from? The person who offers, without accusation, a slightly different frame. Because in that room where everyone is agreeing, your single dissenting presence does not just represent your own private judgment. It gives permission to everyone else in the room who is quietly thinking the same thing, but has not yet found the courage to say it. The spell of unanimity is fragile. It needs everyone to stay silent about their doubt. One voice breaks it. You can be that voice without being a hero, without overturning anything. You can be it with a single honest question asked at the right moment, in the right room, when the crowd has gathered around an obvious certainty and you are still holding, as you should, the small, steady doubt. That is what it means to keep your own mind while standing inside a group. Not withdrawal, not immunity. not the anxious Parisian physician retreating to his salon to watch the masses from a safe distance. It means staying in the room, staying in the conversation, bringing your actual name, your actual face, your actual private reasoning into the space the crowd has been filling with contagion and repetition and vivid images. It means being present, fully present, while being, very precisely and very quietly, yourself. Le Bon declared the era of crowds in 1895 because he was watching the masses enter politics and it frightened him. The masses were going to overwhelm the cultivated, the rational, the individual. The herd instinct would sweep away the careful mind. He was half right. The dynamics he described are real. The contagion is real. The suggestibility is real. The way anonymity dissolves the sentiment of responsibility, real. The demagogue's toolkit of affirmation and repetition, real and still in use, and now running at the speed of servers. But the thing he missed was the other half. The crowd does not erase you. It offers you a replacement identity, and you can notice the offer being made. You can feel the moment when the group's certainty begins to feel like your own certainty, when the group's enemy begins to feel like your enemy, when the slogan begins to feel like something you chose. You can feel that moment because it has a texture that your own genuine thinking does not. It is too fast. It is too certain. It is too intolerant of the question. It feels, in the chest, like righteousness, and righteousness of that particular speed and warmth is almost always borrowed. You can feel it, and feeling it, recognizing it, is most of the distance between being absorbed and being present. The rest is small. Ask where it comes from. Add your name back. Find the one question the crowd has not thought to ask, or simply be the person who stays quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet that has a tension in it, the kind that notices, the kind that has not yet decided. That kind of quiet is its own form of courage in a room that has made up its mind. Le Bon spent a life studying this because he was afraid of what the crowd might do. He ended up writing something that could help you notice what the crowd is doing to you. The frightened man in the anxious salon produced, almost by accident, the tools for a different kind of attention. Not distance, not contempt, not the retreat of the cultivated individual from the barbaric mass, but attention, care, the willingness to stay in the room and ask, calmly, the one question that nobody seems to have asked. That is what we came here for tonight. We have moved through a long distance together, very slowly, in the dark, from a Parisian salon in 1895 to a neighbourhood in Bristol in 1980. From the Salptrier, where Charcot was teaching the properties of suggestion, to a university basement in 1971, where an experiment that seemed to prove everything turned out to prove less than it claimed. From Solomon Asch's room full of Confederates, giving obviously wrong answers, to the single dissenter who changed everything, to your own feed, your own timeline, the psychological crowd that lives in the device on the bedside table. We have met the three engines Le Bon named, the sentiment of invincible numbers, the spreading contagion, the near-hypnotic suggestibility, and the single hinge that makes them turn, the dissolution of personal responsibility that comes with anonymity and the crowd's warmth. We have followed the demagogue's recipe of 1895 and watched it run at the speed of servers. We have heard the correction that took nearly a century to arrive. You are not mindless in a crowd, you are re-identified, and the difference is navigable. We have stood in Bristol in 1980 and noticed that the violence was patterned, not random, which means the crowd is following norms even when it appears to have abandoned them. We have felt the crowd amplify heroism as easily as cruelty. The same mechanism, the same force, a different current running through it. And we have found, in the quiet logic of a room full of Confederates and a single honest voice, the most hopeful finding in this entire body of work. One person who breaks the unanimity is enough. You do not need to remember any of this in the morning. If one thing stayed, let that be enough. Perhaps the image of the crowd offering you a replacement identity, the sense of that handover, the particular quality of certainty that comes with borrowed thinking. Perhaps the single dissenter who collapsed the conformity by simply saying a different thing. Perhaps the feel of anonymity as a mechanism, the way naming yourself, even quietly, restores the weight of your own judgment. Whatever stayed, it is enough. The mind that has been following all of this tonight, the mind that came to rest and ended up thinking, very gently, about these old and important questions, is not a broken mind. It is a restless mind, doing exactly what minds do, trying to understand the world they are moving through, trying to stay themselves in the middle of all that pressure to become someone else's certainty. That is not a flaw. It is the effort of being awake. And tonight, having made that effort, you can set it down. The crowd will be there in the morning, the feed will be there, the mechanisms will be there, patient and identical to what they were in 1895 and in 1951 and in 1980 and tonight. But you will also be there, named with your own reasoning, slow and incomplete and a little uncertain, which is exactly what genuine thinking feels like. With the small capacity to notice the certainty that arrived too fast, to ask where it came from, to be for a moment the one voice that has not yet decided. That is enough. That is, actually, everything. Let the rest go now. Let the names and the dates settle where they will. Let the mechanisms dissolve back into the quiet they came from. There is nothing left to figure out, and nowhere else to be, and the dark outside the window is the same dark it has always been, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to whether anyone in it has remembered the name of an Italian criminologist from 1891. You are here. The night is here. The breathing that has been going on quietly through all of this, unremarked, doing its work without needing anything from you, that breathing is here. One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.